Hello, Dr. Nyamai here. Kindly requesting to activate the trauma team. I have a 30-year-old gentleman who's being wheeled in from Limuru Road. Had an accident about 10 minutes ago. BPs are low. So please activate the trauma team. Thank you.
Hello, how are you?
Hello, how are you? Fine, how are you?
Old male patient, called Commander.
Okay.
Post RTA.
Okay.
He was a border passenger.
Okay.
Complaints of neck pain, abdominal pain, as well as right limb pain.
Okay.
For the airway, his GCS is 14 over 15.
Okay.
So his air is intact.
Okay.
His lung flows are clear.
Okay.
We have arrested the bleeding with a tourniquet on the right femur area.
Okay.
Just coming for the abdomen, he has bruises all over his abdomen.
Okay.
He also has bleeding on his right ear.
Okay.
His vitals, his pulse rate is 120 to 130.
Okay.
His BP's maps are ranging between 55 to 60.
Okay.
So we've given him fluids. He's on his second liter of Ringer's Lactate.
Okay.
For pain management, we have given him Tramadol 100 milligrams. So far, he's saying things.
Okay.
Not that bad.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Joseph, I'd ask you to connect him to the monitor. Okay. Dr. Nyamai, I'd ask you to assess his airway and his breathing.
We are having a BP of 90, 36. Our SpO2 is 75 with an heart rate of 130.
Okay.
Someone connect the patient on a monitor.
So we have a low BP. So let's look for possible sources of
Line
bleeding.
is already fixed. We are having a sugar of 6.5.
Thank you very much, Andrew. How are you feeling?
Pain. Stomach and leg.
Okay. So we're going to look for blood for you to be able to take your BPs a bit higher. They're a bit on the low side, okay? We think you might be bleeding somewhere in the stomach, okay?
Ouch.
Okay.
Ouch.
Okay. So this is just to look for some possible causes of bleeding. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. And your vitals, BP is improving?
Yes, right now we're having a SpO2 of 97 on oxygen. Our blood pressure is 108 over 63.
Okay.
And we're having a heart rate of 111.
Okay. I think from here we'll move to theatre. Okay. We have a positive first. Okay.
Let me just give them a call.
Okay.
Prepare for the OR.
Okay, fine. We've gone through our ABCs. Our airway is secure, it's fine. We have breathing. Our chest is fine. Circulation, we seem to have a problem, a possible bleed in the abdomen, so blunt abdominal injury. We'll move to disability and we'll expose our patient just soon as we transfer our patient.
Once we receive a call, we have a dispatch center. So once they have raised the dispatch center using our call lines, the dispatch EMT notifies an ambulance. So we have two forms of ambulances when it comes to emergencies. We have an ALS ambulance with just the paramedic and the EMT operator, and we have an ALS ambulance with a doctor, emergency doctor on board, which also has the EMT and the paramedic on board. So depending with the kind of case that we are called for, if it's an MI, if it's a resuscitation because of a cardiac arrest, depending with the case, the dispatch is well trained enough to know what ambulance to raise. So once the ambulance has been raised, let's say for example it's the ALS with the emergency doctor, once it has been raised, we prepare and ensure, depending with the case we get, we have all, as you can see here, we have airway, breathing, everything, including emergency drugs that for all sorts of emergencies, we have them ready. So depending with the kind of case we get, we prepare the drugs or we prepare the equipment that we're going to use. If the patient is for intubation, or we feel like the patient should be intubated on scene, once we've evaluated the patient, we also have things, the ventilator, the suction and everything that we can be able to attach the patient. So we are ready just in case the patient requires that kind of care. The importance of this is pre-hospital care in general, I think contributes to the outcome of the patient, because we primarily get the patient as a primary, and then we now bring the patient to the hospital. So if our pre-hospital or our care is not right, the outcome of the patient coming to hospital will also be affected. Yeah. So it's essentially good to have an emergency line, an ambulance emergency line, in case one has an emergency, can be able to call an ambulance, which is well equipped for any sorts of emergencies, so you can be able to stabilize and save a life to get the patient to hospital. One thing I just want to urge Kenyans is there's one, we tend to raise the sirens. At times Kenyans usually wonder, an ambulance is in traffic and the next minute there's a siren. That's a point where the dispatch has called us and we need to, the only thing we're urging at this point is at least give the ambulance way. There are many providers out there. At times it's usually, it destabilizes us when we can't get way. During our heavy traffic times, that's 5 o'clock, 6 p.m. in the evening. So we just urge Kenyans to at least give us way. The other thing is we need to take emergencies seriously, because at the end of the day, the outcome is usually dependent on the first person who receives the patient. So if one can actually have and be aware that you can actually get an ambulance that is going to assist the outcome of the patient, you can just get one of the providers, a number of one of the providers, and be able to call in case of any emergency. It's not it's not an expensive thing to do, because they are not usually expensive. They are actually affordable for all Kenyans. So it's something that we should all be enlightened about.
So while we were here at the A&D, there was a call that came in and the team lead activated a trauma team. What exactly is a trauma team?
All right, so the concept of a trauma team actually comes from an emergency care package for acutely injured trauma patients, which is a concept that was popularized by an American College of Surgeons from the 1970s. Essentially, it was a recognition that when somebody is involved in an accident or is traumatized in a big way, they tend to die in 3 phases. So the patients who die immediately at the scene of sight through easily preventable methods, and others who die an hour later through other preventable ways. So those 2 can easily be mitigated if there's a prioritization of care. So once we recognize, and it goes through a pattern called an ABC pattern, that A are the things which will kill you first, for example, obstruction of your airway, where you can't breathe because there's air building up in your chest, and where you're hemorrhaging. If you can take care of these things in a systematic fashion, the patient has the best chance of recovery. So those things cannot be guessed at. So you have to be prepared before. So once a call comes through that we have a trauma patient and there's a criterion for activation, then the team converges. And when the team converges, they anticipate the patient's arrival, and then they go through giving care to that patient in order of those priorities. So in other words, whether you're a 6-year-old child who's fallen off a building, or a 90-year-old who's fallen down the stairs, or a 36-year-old pregnant woman who suffered burns, or you've been stabbed or you've been shot, the care approach is exactly the same. So the team is activated to be on arrival to give that care in that sequential order. So that's a trauma team.
So who is in this team?
Okay, so the team constitutes of doctors and nurses and allied services. So it constitutes of 4 doctors, 2 nurses, and what we call a radiographer and a phlebotomist at the minimum. Now, depending on how busy the service is, it can be wider or smaller than that, but that's the minimum. So if I could go through exactly what happens is, once we receive a call or the patient has arrived, the initiating doctor is the acute emergency doctor who's here in the trauma bay. He has a criteria which the patient will fulfill. For example, if somebody else has died in the accident, or if the patient has got a low blood pressure, or so forth and so on, he will then activate the trauma service. A central system goes out, and he's the first doctor. Another 3 doctors converge, which include 2 surgeons who from the surgical team, the chief resident in surgery and the junior resident, and then the anesthetist registrar on call. And they're joined by a radiographer who will do the x-rays and a phlebotomist who will come and draw the samples. And the team is also coordinated by 2 nurses, one of who assists in giving care to the patient in terms of lines, and one who takes a system of recording what happens, how, what interventions on, and so on. So that essentially is the trauma team. So when the call goes out, automatically within 60 seconds, they're all assembled here.
Do all hospitals across the country have such kind of system that can be quickly activated to attend to somebody who is in need of emergency care?
All right. So at the moment, we were actually the first hospital to put together the acute trauma team. Although I can tell you various hospitals have some variation of it. And you have to understand that this system has really only been coming up over the last 2-3 years or so. So I'm a member of what we call the ATLS Kenya, which is the umbrella organization led by one of our directors, Dr. Juka. He's from University of Nairobi. So ATLS Kenya is a group of trauma-trained practitioners who offer training to other doctors and nurses. So through that system of training, 2 or 3 months, we train practitioners who then go and are supposed to be leads to inculcate a trauma service in various hospitals. So the hospitals which I know for sure have a trauma service are Aga Khan. I know Nairobi has got some service as well. I know there's definitely one in Moi, and I'm sure that there's one in Kenyatta as well. Outside these 4 hospitals, I really wouldn't know to what level these hospitals are. But it's also important to know that it doesn't require a big commitment for resources. As you saw today, the patient was really treated with an X-ray and personnel. So the most important thing is to train people, doctors and nurses, and they both undergo just a 3-day training. After that, they become certified and they can offer this service. So it's something that can really be expanded to any hospital that gives acute trauma care.
Okay, so let's go just before the patient arrives in hospital. Let's say
Yes.
somebody has fallen from a building or they've been hit by a car by the roadside. What are the simple things that one can do to offer first aid to this person before they arrive at the hospital?
It's a complicated question, I must tell you. So in answering that question, I must say that the trauma service as it is, unfortunately assumes certain things in our environment which are not really true. And I'm sure that's where the question is coming from. So firstly, like I said, this was really popularized by the American College of Surgeons when they saw this huge number of trauma deaths which could really be avoided with simple maneuvers and training. And their systems have a very good pre-hospital care phase. So ambulances respond within 5 to 10 minutes to where the injured are, and the time to hospital from their evacuation is also very short. In our environment, that is far from true. However, the investment that we need to do to improve that pre-hospital care is also not that much. It's training. It's the same training, really. And then obviously equipping our vehicles and people to up to a certain standard. Outside that, to tell layperson the simple thing they could do would really be trying to push the envelope a bit far. So if I could tell you mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which is what, one of the biggest causes of why people die when they have a trauma is that they can no longer breathe themselves. And so somebody needs to provide an airway. A simple maneuver like opening the mouth and taking out some foreign material can save somebody's life. But there's a way in which the mouth has to be opened so that you don't injure somebody's cervical spine or make it worse as you're doing that. Applying pressure to wounds is also another important thing. Tourniquet and direct pressure can help that. So outside those 2 maneuvers of opening the mouth and removing foreign material and applying pressure, there's really not much more somebody without really medical background could do much to assist. So I would say doing those 2 maneuvers I've mentioned and then getting help as fast as possible would really be the crux of the matter when it comes to trauma care. And that should inform us as a nation that this is like a road. You can't build your own. But trauma is a great equalizer. So it is an important thing that all of us should invest in just making a decent pre-hospital trauma care service. That means people to get to where you are and get you to where you can get help. That can save a lot of lives. Another important thing is to remember that we talk about trauma as if it's a trivial issue, but we're a nation where 50% of us are below the age of 18. You may not know this, but the number 1 source of death or killer in patients below the age is not infectious diseases. It's not HIV, it's not cancer, it's trauma. So it is probably the number 1 public health concern, and not much investment is being done. Although the irony is that the investment that is needed in trauma is much less than, say, what is needed in giving oncological services or even stroke care and so on. Because all you need to do is train people over 2 or 3 days, and really you've done 80% of the work. The rest of the equipment they already have, X-rays and CT scans in a few hospitals, and you can provide the kind of level service of trauma that can occur in any hospital anywhere in the world.
For the patient that was here who had internal abdominal bleeding, what next for this patient?
Yes, so the sequence at Ijwa usually starts with activation of the trauma service, the ruling out of life-threatening injuries or the attendant to those injuries, like I said, through an ABCD fashion. Once that patient is stabilized, then we can go to second-tier services. However, this patient is in between. The patient did not stabilize after the initial injury. So there's a life-threatening ongoing hemorrhage in his abdomen, And that means he immediately leaves the emergency trauma area, trauma bed, and he goes to theater, because we have to, so to speak, close the tap. If he's hemorrhaging and is not responding to fluids and blood, then we have to close the tap. So this patient meets a criteria where he is going to go to theater immediately. He'll have an emergency laparotomy, surgery of the belly, to open up and stop the tap what is bleeding, and then he will actually come back out and have another set of scans to see what other injuries he may have in his head and so on. So that's what the usual service would be like. So he's currently in theater at the moment, having the laparotomy to stop the bleeding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then one other thing that was with this patient is he had bleeding and there was a tourniquet applied. And you said if one of the things that people could do is apply pressure where there's bleeding, and some people can actually tie a limb. What is it that people should know about applying that tourniquet or that whatever it is that they've used to tie in order to stop the bleeding?
So the idea is that hemorrhage will lead to exsanguination, which is the medical term to speak that you've lost all your blood volume, which is obviously lethal. So if somebody is hemorrhaging to a great extent and that is a threat to their life, you need to stop whatever means you can to stop the bleeding from taking place. So applying pressure is the simplest mechanism, and a tourniquet application is the next one. A lot of people can apply a tourniquet. A belt is the easiest thing you can use, and you simply need to know how, because if you can tie a belt, you can tie it around the leg or limb. Beyond that, it's really for medical personnel and for time of transfer. So in the past, in the distant past, tourniquets were very popular, and then they came and got out of popular because they used to lead to ischemic injuries and so on of the leg. So the leg was amputated because they could not get blood. We've come to realize now urbanization and the infrastructure has allowed most patients with a tourniquet to get to a hospital in good enough time so that that tourniquet can save them from hemorrhage, but not necessarily cause any further damage. So the simplest answer to your question is that do whatever means that you have that are effective at stopping hemorrhage, then get the patient to where they can get help. Those personnel should obviously know that there is a time lag. Once the tourniquet has been applied, it will stop the hemorrhage, but it will also stop flow to the rest of the leg. So you need to get to a place quickly where the bleeding can be controlled and the tourniquet can be taken off. But really, it should not be unclear that people should be worried about applying a tourniquet that they will hurt the leg. We say life of a limb. So it's unfortunate, but if we have to choose, we will choose the life. We will choose that you stop the patient from hemorrhaging to death, even at the risk of losing the limb. That would be the correct call. Okay.
And in the event of a head injury, somebody has suffered head injury, what is it that people should do? And when they come to hospital, what is it that you do as a trauma team?
It's important. It's interesting that you mentioned a head injury. That's what I do for a living. So it's important to realize that of the portion of patients who die from trauma, majority of them die because of head injury. So it's sort of like one of the most important things that we worry about. Now, unfortunately in the field, what you will really see is just a loss of consciousness. That's externally what you generally will see. A lot happens though, from ranging from lacerations of the brain to bleeds to swelling to many other things, which can only be dealt with a specialized form. So for the population out there, the number one thing is to say, like we said, simple maneuvers. Make sure that they are breathing if they can. Remove that. Don't move them willy-nilly, because the neck is often injured when you have a head injury, and you can paralyze them from the neck downwards if you displace the fractures of the cervical of the neck area. And make sure if they have a hemorrhage, you control that. So what makes head injuries worse is actually those two things. That's the reason why they are at the top of the list under airway. Because if you don't breathe, you don't get oxygen. The one organ which will suffer the most lack of oxygen is the brain. If you hemorrhage, you have low blood pressure. The one organ which will suffer the most again is the brain. So those two maneuvers are actually intended eventually to try and restore function to the brain. Now, when they get here, we usually assess them. So you would be surprised that the brain is actually not in the A, the B, the C. It's actually in the D. Because all those A, B, C lead to perfusion and oxygenation of the D. So that's why we take care of that sequence. But once they get here and the A and the B and the C have been taken care of, the A being the airway, B being the breathing, and C being the circulation in terms of hemorrhage control, then in the D we assess them, and when we see there's an anomaly, which will usually be because of the pupillary response or the fact that they're not moving one side, they're paralyzed and so on, they will then need to go to a scanner after having been stabilized in the primary and secondary part of the trauma care. When they get the scan, then the CT of the brain, which is the CAT scan, is the one that determines what will happen to the patient. So a lot of patients will end up having surgery, either to evacuate clots or to put in a pressure monitor, because pressure is what actually eventually leads to the demise of many patients. Or sometimes you have to take the bone out, to reduce that pressure, because the pressure may already be obviously high. So the treatment therefore will depend on the injury, the extent of the injury, and then what other things need to be done for that patient.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's where we end this show on trauma care, on emergency care, and we've been focusing on the adult patient who suffered a heart attack, who suffered a stroke, and a trauma patient with internal bleeding or abdominal bleeding. Next week, we look at emergencies that affect children. These are pediatric emergencies, from choking, falling from a height, or burns. We simulate to you what you need to do in order to buy time to take that child to receive the care that you saw that was demonstrated here. Many thanks to Aga Khan University Hospital and AAR for being able to bring this to you. I'm Dr. Masi Korir. God bless.